I was looking at the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock, obviously.
This is Alfred Hitchcock speaking.
We might have ended the last video with this quote from Hitchcock. A suspense sequence is weakened because the action is not sufficiently clear. But he has much more to say on the subject of clarity. For example, if two actors should happen to be wearing similar suits, the viewer can't tell one from the other. If a location is not clearly established, the viewer may be wondering where the action is taking place. And if a crucial scene unfolds while he is trying to figure these things out, its emotional impact is dissipated. So it's important to be explicit, to clarify constantly. But clarify, Christopher Nolan does not. Just look at the way he establishes one of his key locations in the film. Even though the film is split into 3 distinct strands, these are not evenly weighted and the mole is given the most screen time. So how it is set up is important, and with that in mind, what do these shots actually tell us? The mole is introduced as both a location and a goal, with a shot reverse shot from Tommy's point of view, and that sets up what it is, but not where it is. And as Baldwin and Thompson say in film art, the viewer should always know where the characters are in relation to one another and to the setting. But here we're given no sense of location or geography. We don't know where Tommy is in relation to the mole. None of the shots leading up to this exchange tell us, except to say that they are nowhere near. And this becomes problematic when you consider that this shot is a close one, as that gives the impression that the structure is actually quite near. Its size in the frame, when taken in conjunction with the soldiers dirty in the shot in the corner, who are all in relative proportion to Tommy, implies that all 3 elements are within reasonable distance of each other. We get this impression because of the nature of the eyeline match, which is at its core a simple idea but a powerful one, since the directional quality of the eyeline creates a strong spatial continuity. And that makes sense because to be looked at, an object must be near the looker. So the size of an object in a POV has to be proportional to the distance between it and the looker, unless we're given a clear reason why it would be bigger, such as in this scene from Rear Window, wherein Jeff has to change the size of his lens to get a closer look at Thorwald. But that is not what is happening in this shot. As we've previously seen, the mole has already been shown to be indistinguishable from the horizon when Tommy lands on the beach. So when I asked, what do these shots tell us? This shot is actually deliberately giving us misinformation. And this is a problem because the suspense of the sequence that follows is entirely dependent upon the distance between Tommy and the mole.
Getting from A to B, can they find a way off this beach alive?
We know what the motivation is. The boat is about to leave. This horn blast cues us into that, which is visual storytelling, right? But glibness aside, this scenario is a prototypical example of Nolan's vision for the film.
Because Dunkirk is a great ticking clock story.
But the imperative behind it is lost because the distance they have to run has never clearly been established. What would provide that information would be a shot of the 2 objects in frame together at the same time, so then we could gauge a distance. And we do get one, but only after they've already arrived at the mole, so when it is narratively redundant. As Hitchcock said, if a crucial scene unfolds while the audience is trying to figure these things out, its emotional impact is dissipated. What would be helpful would be a shot that put all the relevant information into context, like an aerial shot or a bird's eye point of view. Exactly like this one, except one that didn't come 26 minutes into the film, after the structure had already been set up, after the first bombing raid, and after Tommy had already made his way onto the mole and then gotten off again. This sequence with Tommy is particularly troublesome when you compare it to this scene on the boat, the Moonstone. This shot uses all 3 fields of depth, with an active middle and foreground, and a dormant background that is activated when the shot reframes, which pushes the foreground into its own single, but brings the characters in the back into the drama. And it does that with these 2 shots. But they also serve to reaffirm the spatial relationship between the entrance to the hull and the interior of the wheelhouse. So later on in the film, when Useless George falls down the stairs, we don't actually need to see him fall because the space was established earlier and we know where he's gone. And this is what is so frustrating. Nolan can show us a drama that takes place in a visually cohesive space, but he picks and chooses when he does that. and that is to the detriment of the suspense he's trying to build. But it's not just location. The suspense is also undermined by the film's approach to character, which despite the largely positive reception, was one of the more prominent criticisms it received. For example, Christian Lawrenson of the New Republic pointed out that the Germans in Dunkirk are a faceless menace, and the desperate young British soldiers can be hard to differentiate. Whilst Richard Brody complained in the New Yorker that Dunkirk was part of a recent trend in movies to blank out characters, to filter out the thoughts and emotions that render them as complex individuals, rather than visual shorthand types. Slant.com was more ambivalent, initially praising this approach, saying, at first this is to the film's credit, the characters don't waste time offering backstory or personality quirks, as they're too focused on the immediacy of survival. After a time, however, the blurred lines between characters only exacerbate the editing's cold, distancing effect. The focus of all of these criticisms was on Dunkirk's rejection of the idea that the motivation behind character behaviour should be informed by backstory.
Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up.
I wanted to save Gotham. I failed.
Why do we fall, sir? So that we can learn to pick ourselves up.
And obviously this was part of Nolan's plan.
It's not about backstory. It's about in the moment. It's about meeting people right then and there.
And of course, backstory is not an essential element. Just look at one of Dunkirk's major influences,
Those wages of fear,
which is about a group of desperate men who take on a ridiculously dangerous job in order to get enough money to leave the dead-end town they're stranded in.
It's a real tough job. I've got to get a ton of nitroglycerin to Derrick 16.
Oh my goodness!
The film gives us plenty of motivation, but we're never told why these men are stuck there in the first place. And that's because we don't need to know. So there are clearly similarities with Dunkirk here. But the problem with this approach in Nolan's film is simply one of poor execution. In The Wages of Fear, for example, the characters are clearly distinct. Just consider how different these men look from one another. In Dunkirk, that is not the case, and that's the problem. Each of Clouseau's protagonists are clearly individuated. Nolan's are not. This lack of individuality may well be intentional, but as the critic Matt Zoller points out in his otherwise admiring review, the persistent anonymity of the characters is one of the film's stumbling blocks, and that just because a gambit is a conscious part of the film's design doesn't mean it always works. And this confusion is wholly visual. None of the characters are individuated enough to be able to tell them apart at a glance, because Nolan fails to give us the visual cues to be able to individuate them. This is not a problem when the camera is locked to one character, like it is with Tommy on the beach at the beginning, but when the film is dark, as it often is, and it cuts between various characters, it can become difficult to differentiate them, especially when the images are unclear and indistinct, such as any scene that involves soldiers in water. And because it's difficult to tell the characters apart, it can be challenging to follow the action. And this undermines Nolan's own remit of empathy through turmoil.
You're looking at their physical situation. You're looking at the task they're faced with physically. The film is dragging you into an empathetic relationship with them through the openness of their expressions and the genuineness of their reactions. And you are being dragged along on their journey. You want them to succeed by virtue of the fact that you are empathizing with another human being.
Let's hear that bit again.
The film is dragging you into an empathetic relationship with them through the openness of their expressions, through the openness of their expressions, through the openness of their expressions, through the openness of their expressions.
For that to work, we have to be able to see their expressions, and we can't do that if we don't recognize them. We can't be concerned about them if we don't know who they are. Which brings us back to Hitchcock's contention that if two actors should happen to be wearing similar suits, the viewer can't tell one from the other. And that might seem absurd at first, but consider this sequence. The reason this is so hard to follow is because the characters are impossible to differentiate. Both the protagonists and those attacking them are dressed in white, which is a ridiculous decision given that they're being filmed against snow. Yes, the assailants are wearing black masks and have markings on their suit, but this is only really apparent in the close-ups. In the wide shots where there is motion blur and trees muddying the image, this visual distinction gets lost amongst the imprecise camera work and the chaotic editing. So whilst it's perfectly rational within the film for the characters to want to camouflage themselves, that doesn't help the audience. And it's the same problem with Dunkirk. Now I know the obvious rebuttal to this point is historical accuracy, or rather historical authenticity. They're soldiers, so of course they all wear the same uniform, have the same haircut, and of course they're all white, so therefore it's going to be hard to differentiate between them, and therefore that is a concession we're just going to have to make. But I say no, there are ways around it. You can still provide people with visual cues even when the characters are designed to be anonymous. And Nolan knows this.
We did not go for authenticity at the expense of clarity for the audience. So there are decisions that were made. For example, the enemy planes, the ME-109, has a yellow nose, and people who really know this stuff know that it was only painted yellow about 2 months after these events. The rest of the war, but trying to give people visual cues to distinguish between the German planes and the Spitfires, particularly for people unfamiliar with the history.
It just seems he got his priorities confused.